who's grabbed the attention of many millions of people around the world. So although she hasn't yet been asked to speak here, she is coming. She's come. And I met her a little earlier this week in London's Natural History Museum, where I began by asking if she thought she had got anywhere with the politicians.
I mean, it depends on how you define get anywhere. Of course, the climate movement has succeeded in sort of moving the public discourse and changing the debate in it, and the climate crisis has gotten more focused now, and more and more people are going out on the streets, and that's of course a big step in the right direction. But then of course we have to also zoom out a bit and see where we are compared to where we would need to be. The global emissions are still increasing, and 2021 is projected to experience the second highest emission rise ever recorded. So that, of course, is a clear sign that we are still moving very much in the wrong direction.
Because I guess a lot of the political leaders would say, you know, I talk about climate change all the time, I've allocated big budgets, I've set ambitious targets. What more can I do for Greta Thunberg to think that I'm doing the right thing?
Yeah. For example, the UK, one popular thing for the UK to say is that you have reduced your emissions by 44% since 1990. And of course that sounds good, it looks good on paper, but if you actually look into the actual emissions, that's not the case. If you include all emissions like the burning of biomass, consumption-based emissions, and exports of fossil fuels and so on. So of course the situation is almost always much worse in reality than what it's being portrayed as.
Have you yet spoken to an elected political leader and looked them in the eye and thought, this person gets it?
I mean, there are many people who want to do more than they are doing, and who want to do more than they are able to do, based on their support from their voters. We must also remember that a politician's job is to fulfill the wishes of the voters, and if there's no massive public pressure from the outside, then they will get away with continuing like now. And politicians very often, as long as they get away with doing something, and the same as CEOs and lobbyists, as long as they get away with doing something, they will continue, unfortunately. So unless we really put massive pressure on them, they will continue.
What about the Queen? The Queen here has said it's really irritating when people say but they don't do. Do you agree with her?
Yeah, I think most people agree with that.
I'm very interested in how the change is happening and at what level of politics it's happening. I mentioned the Queen, but the Pope is leader of 1 billion Catholics around the world and has been quite outspoken now. Does that make a real difference, do you think?
I think when people like that speak up, I think it doesn't make a real difference when they are bold enough. Of course, many people just do it because it makes them popular, it makes them sound good. But of course, then I'm sure that there are many people who actually do it because they care as well.
You're 18 now. You could stand for elected office in Sweden. Have you ever thought about doing that yourself? You'd have huge support, I'm sure.
I thought of the possibility, but I don't know.
Not for you?
No, at least not right now. What's needed now is a big change in the narrative that we see the climate crisis. We need it to reach a critical mass with people who are demanding change. And right now it's more efficient to do that on the streets than to do it from inside.
But maybe one day in the long future, when you've won the battle in public opinion. We'll see. Can I ask, have you been asked to speak at this climate change conference, COP?
I don't know. It's very unclear, not officially.
Not officially, and why do you think that might be? Because a lot of people say there are not enough young voices at COP.
Yeah. Of course, this is not just a question about me, but I think that many people might be scared that if they invite too many radical young people, then that might make them look bad.
And do you think that's what's going wrong with COP already, that there aren't enough of the more radical young voices being heard?
Not necessarily the radical young voices, but we need more representation from the so-called global south. It's not fair when, for example, one country sends lots and lots of delegates, and then another country is very underrepresented. That, of course, already creates an imbalance.
Now, this conference is all about keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. At this stage, do you think that's going to succeed? Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't know. It can. It's possible in theory. it's up to us if we want that to happen.
Let me ask you about the most powerful person coming to COP in Glasgow, which is President Biden, Joe Biden. He's just announced a £500 billion plan to deal with climate change, and he's been working very, very hard with Congress and so forth. How well do you think he's been doing? Could he be a real leader on climate change?
Of course, everyone has the possibility, but if they continue like now, no.
I just wonder what more he can do. I mean, he is challenging in the courts to stop mining and stop oil extraction on federal land. You know, he's used up all his political capital on in Congress to try and get this through. He is working quite hard.
Yeah, we all understand, activists, we understand that this doesn't fall on one single person. But of course, when you are a leader of the most powerful country in the world, then you have lots of responsibility. And when the US is actually, in fact, expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, that is a clear sign that they are not really treating the climate crisis as an emergency.
Was it fair, in retrospect, to say blah, blah, blah about him?
It was not directed to one person. I took lots of quotes from lots of world leaders and say blah, blah, blah. But I think so.
You think it was fair? Okay. Let me ask you about something another American said, John Kerry, who I interviewed, and he said 50% of the action against stopping climate change is going to come from new technology. What do you say to that?
I mean, if that was the case, that would be great. I don't think any activist is against new technology, but we cannot say for sure that we know that this will happen when it's in fact based on technologies that today are, to a large extent, prototypes that are very far from working on the scale that they are just counting on them to work. I think that might be a bit naive.
Just turning to Britain for a second, the UK government has just announced it's going to halve taxes on domestic flights. What does that say about the UK position on leading on climate change?
I mean, of course we can't talk about this in like one single policy and so on, but when you see a pattern of these policies that all the time are avoiding taking real action, and then I think you can draw conclusions from that pattern that climate action is not really our main priority right now.
So this is really about public pressure and so on. There's a big controversy in Britain at the moment about tactics, something that you know a lot about blocking roads and so on. A lot of people would say that those kind of tactics just put people off.
I think as long as, of course, to make clear, as long as no one gets hurt, and as long as, then I think sometimes you need to anger some people. Like, for instance, the school strike movement would never have become so big if there wasn't friction, if some people didn't get pissed off.
COP is taking place, obviously, in Scotland, and there's an awful lot of people in Scotland, particularly around Aberdeen and the east coast there, whose jobs, whose livelihoods, whose futures depend upon the oil and gas industry. Now, I know that you have spoken to the families of coal miners and coal miners themselves in Germany and similarly in the United States. So what would you say to those people in Scotland who are really worried that their own economic futures are going to be destroyed by these promises?
Yeah. Of course, we understand. And that's just the fact that there is that kind of fear is just a clear sign that we have not been handling the climate crisis in the way it should. Because the way we need to is that no one gets left behind, and that people are being taken care of. So of course that's a sign of failure from the politicians' side.
So to achieve a really, really big change in the kind of public atmosphere, the public mood about this, you need to mobilize millions and millions of people, some of them watching this program, sitting at home, wondering, you know, they've got their jobs, they've got their bills, they've got their anxieties and their worries and so forth, and you need to get them out onto the streets, you need to get them active. So how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? We will all have to play a part in that, in figuring out how to do that. And that's why we are calling for more people to join the climate movement, because we need every possible way. We need to push in the right direction from every possible angle.
Let me ask you about another thing that people may be thinking. We're being asked in this country to remove gas boilers, change the way we heat and insulate our houses. Many families will have big financial hits on all of those kind of things. And they'll be sitting there at home thinking, why should we be doing this when China, for instance, is still building more coal-fired power stations?
Yeah.
Why should we be leading? What would you say to them?
Yeah, exactly. That's what everyone says. And that's what makes it so hard, because you can always blame someone else. In Sweden, for instance, we can say, why should we do this when you just like look at the UK? I mean, it's always someone that's bigger that you can blame on. And that's why it's more important that we need to work together internationally and globally to make sure that everyone does this transition. Not the least pushing China, who are still building coal power plants, which today is quite out of touch with the reality, if you ask me.
And of course, but you know, you're from Sweden, and like the UK, in Sweden there is freedom to protest and interest in protests and different voices. That's not necessarily the same in China and in Russia and in other countries. Do you talk at all to climate activists, for instance, in China, about what they're doing?
Yeah, I try to, as much as I can, and it puts like our perspective in a whole new perspective, because it makes you just feel so grateful that we are actually able to protest, and that just puts more responsibility on us who actually have the right to protest, to use that right, not just for our sake, but for everyone's sake, especially for their sake, to help them as well.
Let me just talk about the future, because you're leading part of a generation of young climate activists, and you've made a lot of waves. You've been, talked about a lot. What do you think you got right, and what would you say to the next generation about doing it differently?
I think one big thing is that it was so spontaneous, this movement. It just completely blew out of proportion from nothing. Well, of course, it wasn't from nothing. It wasn't just out of a vacuum, because there was this miscontent with how the world was, and people were sick of all the empty words and empty promises from our elected leaders. An advice I would give, I don't know, maybe in the beginning that you will receive lots of criticism in the beginning, but that is necessary in order for the movement to grow. Because you change norms very, very quickly. Just some years ago, it was being an activist was considered to be something very radical and like something a bit like strange. Now an activist is something that people aspire to be.
So if you're only hearing words from governments and not the action that you want, every time you launch a campaign and you get attention, then it gets kind of lost in the kind of complexities of democratic politics. Is there a point where you think, do you know what, Greta, I'm going to give up on this. It's over. I can't make the change I need to make.
No, at least not now, because we know that change is possible. We can just look back in history and see that there have been massive changes in society that have been unprecedented. So, and if we felt like there wasn't any hope, then we wouldn't be activists. We are activists because we are very positive that we can achieve change.
I mean, the human mammal has been extraordinary. You know, we found a cure for polio. We've produced a vaccine for the coronavirus in just a year. We've done all sorts of extraordinary things. Do you think humanity can respond to the climate crisis in a way that's proportionate and successful?
I do. If we switched our focus from trying to create loopholes and excuses to not take action, which is very much the case now, no matter how you see it, if we switch from that focus to actually trying to combat climate change in a way that would actually solve it, taking into account the whole perspective, then I think that we could achieve massive changes. And of course, we must also remember that there's not a point where everything is lost. There's not like a tipping point where we pause and now everything is lost. There's no point in doing anything. If we can't keep the global average temperature rise to below 1.5, then we do 1.6, and then 1.7, and so on. We can always prevent things from getting worse. It's never too late to do as much as we can.
All right, Greta Thunberg, thanks very, very much indeed for talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for watching, and thanks to all my guests. I'll be back next week at 9 a.m. on BBC One. Until then, pull on your wellies and have a good weekend. Goodbye.